Now, today we're going to talk about utilitarianism, and same on Wednesday. It is probably the most recent philosophical theory, and it is also a product of this same scientific revolution which we saw happening and talked about already in this class. Same revolution that brought Nietzsche's philosophy. However, Nietzsche is obviously exciting, but it's kind of hard to employ him for regular ethical dilemmas. It is more of an inspiring kind of reading and makes you think, but nonetheless utilitarianism is a lot more applicable. That was an attempt to use the same ideas based on science and empiricism, nonetheless to come up with something which is more usable for all of us. So today we're going to talk about, first of all, positivism, which is kind of a predecessor of utilitarianism in many ways. And then Bentham, who is originator of utilitarianism. Mill will be next time. Mill is a little bit more, I guess, interesting than Bentham, so make sure to do the reading. The reading is right there on canvas underneath the chapter quizzes and all that. If you open it up on Cengage, MindTap, you'll see there's a link to Mill's utilitarianism. Anyway, so first of all, like I said, both positivism and utilitarianism have several things in common. Both of them are product of these new times, the times of what Nietzsche called the death of God, rigorous empiricism. They are trying to base everything on scientific approach. In fact, it's even scientism. We'll talk in a second about scientism. All areas of human concern are credible only to the degree that their principles could be derived from science. Empiricism is when you use only observation and what your senses are telling you to make decisions about life and everything. So that would be empiricism and scientism. Second, all of these philosophers, Comte, Bentham, and Mill, interested in developing moral and social theories that would lead to reform of society based on scientific foundations. The idea was, now that we know that you can use science for so many amazing things, why not use it for life of society, for ethics, for legal purposes, and so on, to apply to the way people organize themselves. And they also were all secularists, suspicious of traditional religion. Not necessarily atheists, although maybe there's definitely some of that too, but mainly agnostics. In other words, saying that maybe there's God, maybe there's no God, who knows? We cannot rely on that. We have to rely on science and leave religion aside. So this is common to all three. Scientism, that is a belief that science is the only reliable source of knowledge and values. It was growing bigger and bigger, starting from probably around 16th, 17th century, and by the 19th century it was already in full force. All areas of human concern, whether psychology, morals, politics, or religion, credible only to the degree that their principles could be derived from science. And since metaphysics, remember metaphysics, this part of philosophy which deals with nature of reality, metaphysics typically deals with claims about reality that go beyond and directly of what is directly observed. Positivists and utilitarianists were outspoken anti-metaphysicians. So they were basically dismissing that, at least somewhat. Okay, so first of all, Comte, positivism. Positivism was really popular during the 19th century, and Auguste Comte is an originator of this movement. He was born 1798, died 1857, so obviously older than Nietzsche. Nietzsche read him, knew about him too. He developed the bulk of his writing trying to develop scientifically based philosophy that would be free of all speculation whatsoever, anchored firmly in positive knowledge, hence the name Positivism. Trying to only use science and observation. The only claims positivists would embrace are those that people have empirically verified. The ultimate purpose: enable us to control our environment, first of all. And he got an interesting theory about how society develops through stages. Human society in particular. First there is a theological stage. That is the earliest days of the humanity. Humanity is in its infancy. And during this time, we develop fetishism or animism through polytheism first, right? Multiple gods, the god of good weather, the god of this and that. And then it culminates in monotheism, one god, but this is the early stage. Then people kind of start moving away from that and enter a second stage, which he called metaphysical stage, when we try to explain events in terms of impersonal and hidden causes. No longer necessarily God, but hidden causes of some sort, using abstract notions such as forces, essences, faculties. Of course, the crowning stage, which he thought we were finally entering, is positivism, when we can finally abandon all those illusions and base everything on science. So in this sense, as you can see, there is a lot of similarity with Nietzsche, but Comte really tried to base the entire theory on science. He also thought that the sciences themselves can be ranked. He was ranking them in the following way, starting from most simple and abstract all the way to more complex and concrete. So the most simple and abstract is mathematics. Next one, slightly more complex and concrete, would be astronomy. Next one, physics, then chemistry, then physiology or biology as we would call it today. And finally, he said there is a crowning science, I say on top of all that, which is the most complex and concrete. And this is what we today call sociology. Sociology originated around this time. In fact, I believe he is the one who coined the term sociology. So they kind of all involve the previous science. So astronomy is based on mathematics. Now physics based on astronomy and mathematics. Chemistry based on physics, astronomy, and mathematics. Physiology based on chemistry, physics, astronomy, and mathematics, and finally sociology based on all of them. It should involve physiology, chemistry, physics, astronomy, and mathematics. He did not like psychology, though. He thought psychology was a fake science. Yeah, he thought that, well, the reason, though, is that he thought the way we behave is determined by society pretty much 100%. So it's a combination of the genetics, which is physiology, and society. Because there is no like individual type of motivation of any kind. So again, just like with Nietzsche, if you go towards this hard scientific approach and abandon any beliefs in any kind of outside forces, it does seem like everything is fully determined. Nietzsche kind of goes even more in this direction. In fact, like I said last time, if you really read him, he would more or less say that there's nothing we can change, we can only embrace the way life the way it is. But these philosophers were trying to figure out, well, okay, let's kind of put it aside. I guess they were not really thinking very much about whether or not everything is so determined that we cannot change it. Let's try to change it and not worry too much whether we can change it. So in that sense, he thought, you can change, but you need to adjust the way society works, the rules of the society. And eventually, he came up with the scientific religion. He thought that some form of religion is still necessary for us, but since it has to be based on fully scientific approach, it was scientific religion. Kind of a combination. The sociology of Comte was a combination of social psychology, economics, political theory, and history. Now that is a social psychology, just studying the way psychology works at the macro level with large groups of people. And ethics for him is the application of the laws of human behavior to effective social planning. Obviously, the governments and organizations should plan how to organize everything. And so for this, he thought this new religion is necessary, the religion of humanity. Scientifically respectable religion that will have all the emotional appeal and motivating force of Christianity without its theological and metaphysical baggage. The supreme being in this case would be the humanity itself. Humanity, all of us, we are the supreme being, and there is also kind of a holy trinity of sorts: humanity, earth, and space. So that would be the holy trinity. We should all pray to the humanity. Eventually, the way he developed his system, Mill said, is one of the most brutal ways of oppressing human beings I could possibly imagine. He tried to indeed have everybody basically completely dissolved in the society. Practically no individuality of any kind. Everybody is just doing everything for the benefit of everyone else. And of course it was somewhat utopian, and his work, especially towards the end of his life, became a little weird because religion of humanity and so on. But it was very influential. So that would be Comte. Now, Jeremy Bentham, originator of Utilitarianism. Bentham was older. He actually was born like 50 years before Comte in 1748, but he lived very long life until 1832 already, and was very active throughout his life, especially towards the end. So he already contributed towards these conversations of the middle of the 19th century. He's actually specialized in law. To begin with, he was a lawyer, and he was more interested in legal side of the whole thing. Significant contribution to jurisprudence. Now, interestingly enough, this picture is of his body, which you can today see at the University College of London. Why is it there? Well, he actually wrote in his will that he wants his body to be present during the meetings of the faculty, or the board rather, meetings of the board pretty much forever. And that's what they're doing. Every time they have a meeting, they roll in his body, which, as you can see, has been preserved through, I don't know, some scientific means. The other funny part here is, well, on this picture you see his actual head right here. Why is his head here? Well, it was, of course, to begin with, attached to his body, but then it started falling off because, I guess, the neck and all that has gotten rotten. And then the students also played a prank. They stole his head and played football with it. Eventually, the head was placed at his feet, and now it actually is removed. They decided to remove it completely. So if you go to University College London today, you can see it. It's right there in one of the halls, except without the head. Yeah, interesting guy. But, well, I suspect that he was a full-blown atheist. He did not believe in God at all, and he just thought that since the death is the end of life anyway, why not have a little fun? Now, just like Comte, he was trying to use scientific foundations for all of his ideas. He ferociously attacks the belief in a natural moral law. Remember, natural moral law, that the laws of morality are kind of given by God or somehow universal and everybody can figure them out. He did not think that was the case at all. He thought that there's no such thing as natural moral law. Law is what we figure out ourselves. But how do we figure it out? He thought we should do it based on science. That's the best way. Use science, use observation, and try to make sure that your legislation follows whatever you have found. So having rejected the prevailing theories concerning the foundations of morals, society, and government, he sets out a program to replace them on a scientific basis. And he begins with the theory of psychology, from which he derives the theory of morality, and then goes on to apply those to government and social policy. So what did he find? This is the quote, the famous quote. He says, "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects, are fastened to their throne, to the throne of pain and pleasure." He was trying to rework the definitions and to figure out how definitions can be connected to empirical phenomena. So he thought that the only real things which we can talk about are indeed pleasure and pain. The words such as duty, morality do not have any empirical foundation in anything at all. So you have to also fasten them to pleasure and pain in some way, because that's pretty much the only real thing we can connect them to. Now, that's known as psychological hedonism. Right? Psychological hedonism, descriptive theory according to which hedone in Greek means joy or pleasure. And it says that we are seeking pleasure all the time. Human beings seek pleasure. How can you apply it to literally every case? Well, here are some examples. The religious martyr. You may say, what kind of pleasure is religious martyr possibly could be seeking? Well, religious martyr dies for their faith because she believes that great will be the reward in heaven, right? That's the idea. So the pleasure in this case will come in heaven. There is a great pleasure out there. You just need to first die painfully, but the pleasure is so great that that pain is worth it. Another example, the mother who lives in poverty to send her son to college. What pleasure does she get? Well, she gets pleasure from his accomplishments. By the way, remember we talked about psychological egoism. So this is the difference with psychological hedonism. Psychological egoism says that we are doing everything for selfish purposes. Hedonism is slightly different, even though it may seem like, well, isn't pleasure always selfish? But as you can see with some of these examples, not necessarily so. You can do something for somebody else and still derive pleasure from it. Whether it's selfish or not, well, I guess in some way you may say it also is selfish because the pleasure in the end of the day is yours, but there is a difference between seeking pleasure and just doing it for yourself. And finally, masochist. Why would the masochist, how can masochists seek pleasure? Well, clearly they also live to be hurt simply to get emotional pleasure from things most of us would avoid. We, at least most of us who are not masochists, do not enjoy pleasure. They enjoy pleasure. So pain, torture, not pleasure. So masochist just enjoys it. It seems strange for most of us, but for masochists it's not strange. So in the end of the day, even though they torture themselves or let others torture them, they still derive pleasure from it. So the pleasure is at the end of all that. So utilitarianism is a step of consequentialism. Remember we talked about elements of the act. So you have motive, you have act, you have consequences. So consequentialism just looks at the consequences. It says, never mind motive. The most important thing is the outcome, the result. And utilitarianism is like that. When we talk about deontological ethics next week and Kant, he actually puts emphasis on the motive only. He says, never mind the consequences, we don't know the consequences, let's put it on the motive. But utilitarianism, on the other hand, is fully teleological. So telos is the goal. What is your goal? This is what you should be looking on. The foundation of utilitarianism is principle of utility, or that property in any object whereby it tends to produce benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness. All this in the present case comes to the same thing. Or, what comes again to the same thing, to prevent the happening of mischief, pain, evil, or unhappiness to the party whose interest is considered. So, benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, according to utilitarianism, is pretty much the same thing. Right? If you would seeking pleasure, that's why you're calling it good, and that is what makes you happy. Now, the two alternatives, like I said, so he was looking at a couple of alternatives. He was saying asceticism. What is asceticism? The action is right if it denies pleasure, but he thought that was kind of inconsistent. You really just fooling yourself. If denying pleasure gives you pleasure, then it actually is giving you pleasure. And if it does not, then there's something wrong with you. Basically, he thought that ascets would still be deriving pleasure from what they do, even though they are trying to avoid all physical pleasure. As we will see towards the end when we talk about Epicureanism, that is similar to what they thought. And the other possibility, sympathy and antipathy. But here he thought that ethical judgments based on this would be very difficult to apply because they are subjective and arbitrary. Right? How can you base laws on sympathy and antipathy? Who do we feel sympathy towards? How can we use it for legal purposes, for organization of society? It seems like something you really cannot apply in any consistent way. Maybe in your personal life you can sometimes do that, but then he would say, well, you can still bring it down to pleasure, the pleasure you are feeling from sympathy towards other people. And why then make it about sympathy and not about pleasure? So overall goal, the greatest happiness for the greatest number. An action conforms to the principle of utility when the tendency it has to augment the happiness of the community is greater than it has to diminish it. Right? So that's why you can also evaluate your own actions on this principle and, more importantly, of course, for Bentham, the laws. What laws the parliament should pass, what laws the country should have, maximizing pleasure. The fundamental moral rule of utilitarianism is act always to promote the greatest happiness for the greatest number. But he actually didn't think that there are higher and lower pleasures. He thought pleasure is pleasure. So here is the good quote on that subject. Prejudice apart, the game of pushpin is equal value with the arts and sciences of music and poetry. If the game of pushpin furnish more pleasure, it is more valuable than either. That's what Bentham thought. Actually, Mill will disagree with it when we talk about Mill next time. He has more interesting and more complex system. But for Bentham, pleasure is pleasure. If you get more pleasure from a game of pushpin, which basically like checkers, you can say, then it is better than art. If you get more pleasure from art, great, then art is better for you. But other than that, there is no difference between them whatsoever. Remember the instrumental goods and intrinsic goods distinction. So instrumental goods are the ones which are used for something else. Intrinsic are good for themselves. So utilitarianism actually thought that the only intrinsic goods are happiness and pleasure, which for them is more or less the same thing. When you have pleasure, you are happy. Everything else just serves them. So things like justice, for example, only is good because it brings happiness and pleasure. And if it doesn't, then it is not good. Why? Because what exactly is justice? You can only connect it to something more concrete based on the principle of pleasure and pain. You cannot scientifically evaluate it based on anything else other than pleasure and pain. So utilitarians reject the idea that some acts are intrinsically good or evil. Good or evil for them is just, again, just different names for pleasure and pain. Everything is reduced to pleasure and happiness. Goes back to Greece, like I said. Epicureans were the first ones who developed this theory. Epicurus, who lived between 341 and 270 before Christ. He is actually a contemporary, almost contemporary of Aristotle. Aristotle was still alive when he was already born, although Aristotle could have been his father, let's put it this way. Epicureanism became a very, very popular philosophy at the time. So this is Epicurus, this is his statue. 7 years after the death of Plato, he was born, 341 BC, purchased the garden at the urge of Athens, where he created a very close-knit philosophical commune. They were all living together and practicing this Epicurean approach, Epicureans. Another thing they are famous for is they actually accepted atomism of Democritus. Remember the atomism, the idea that everything is made of tiny little chunks. So they accepted it, but they adjusted it a little bit because according to them, those chunks, the atoms, can randomly move around based on their different shapes and based on gravity. So that to them would be something which actually explains freedom of the will. It's an interesting idea because you see with atomism and with fully scientific approach, we do have a little bit of difficulty explaining freedom of the will. Do you think that is possible to explain freedom of the will based on this principle of randomness? Is this a way out of it? Sometimes, even today, people say, well, if we use some of the quantum physics, which has this principle of uncertainty, does it explain freedom of the will? We understand the problem, right? Because if everything is determined by the laws of physics, it seems like we have no freedom. But let's say physics tells us that some things are truly random. Is this the way out of it? Does it help us? Is randomness the same thing as freedom? No. And that is a problem, right? It becomes impossible to predict something, but if your actions are randomly determined, they still are determined. Freedom presumes agency of some sort, not randomness. If you decide to flip a coin and make an action based on the result of the coin, even if it is truly random, would you say that this is a free action? No, because in a sense you are giving up your freedom to the coin. The coin then determines what you're going to do. So that's kind of the problem. But the Epicureans thought that maybe it will help. So it was very attractive philosophy for a very long time. Let's take a look at it a little bit, because they actually have bad reputation. People say, oh, you're Epicurean, and they mean that all you seek is pleasure. Well, indeed, they actually connected it to pleasure too. Pleasure is the starting point and goal of living blessedly. That's what Epicurus was teaching. They also have this psychological hedonism, saying that this is what people seeking pleasure. But they also went one step further to ethical hedonism. They said this is what people should do. There is nothing wrong with seeking pleasure. So basically, for Epicurus, the pursuit of pleasure both describes human behavior, that's what we do, and prescribes, that is the ultimate value of human life. This is what we should be seeking, pleasure. There's nothing wrong with it. And I guess that's why they got this bad rap, because everybody thought they were just enjoying themselves all the time. But there's a lot more subtlety to this. The most important part of it is described by the Greek word ataraxia. Ataraxia is freedom from care. Why? Because care is actually what makes us unhappy. Pursue pleasure and avoid pain is overall principle. But how do you avoid pain? Too much pleasure can bring you pain too. The good life would be one which achieves repose, tranquility, quietude. Ataraxia is the most valuable type of pleasure, and it results from three things, Epicurus thought. First of all, ridding ourselves of the fears of God and death. He thought the fears of God and death is the worst part. They actually do not let us enjoy our life. Well, I guess with death it is more or less obvious, right? Why would getting rid of the fear of death help you live more fulfilled life? Well, nobody wants to die. We periodically think about it, and it makes us unhappy. But what about God? Do you think getting rid of yourself of fear of God would make your life happy? What did he mean by that? Exactly, like the punishment from God. The fear of God, people are anxious. They constantly think, oh, does God see me now? What is he going to think about me doing this or not doing that? So he thought that that was obviously a source of unhappiness. We should get rid of ourselves of this. But at the same time, maximizing independence of fortune and minimizing our needs. Because the more needs you have, the more you depend on misfortune. If you have especially a lot of expensive stuff, what can happen to this stuff? If you have a large house, it can burn down, or somebody can take it away from you. You'll be constantly worried. The more stuff you have, the more luxurious life you live, the more you have to lose. So independence is to get rid of all this stuff and minimize. And of course, you should also know how bodily pain, if it comes our way, can be endured. Because let's face it, at least sometimes in life, we all have some sort of pain, and we have to endure that pain. So mental pains, according to Epicurus, were the worst. Mental pain, not physical ones. Physical pains are not as bad. And therefore, the unjust people, the people who commit crimes, are just stupid. They're bad calculators. Any sort of short-term bodily pleasure they gained from their wrongdoings will be outweighed by their long-term anxiety at the prospect of being found out. Never even mind the fact that they may, in fact, be caught and punished. But just this constant worry that somebody will find out is worse than whatever pleasure you may get from, I don't know, stealing something, or committing some sort of fraud, or whatever it is you have done. That will be eating at you for the rest of your life. So all the traditional values which Greeks had, justice, moderation, courage, and wisdom, according to Epicurus, are instrumental, because again the main goal of our life is pleasure, and so pleasure is the only intrinsic good. In that he disagreed with both Plato and Aristotle. The just life is most free from disturbance, but the unjust life is full of greatest disturbance. So that's why we should live just life, not because justice is some abstract form like Plato thought, but because it just creates trouble. You will feel constantly worried. He didn't think that, remember the Plato's example of the perfectly just and perfectly unjust man. He didn't think there is, even if you can get away with it, but you yourself know that you did all these things, right? So you will always be worried that somebody will find out, that something will come up. It's impossible to be completely immune to these types of worries, and therefore that would be making you unhappy. So this is how they divided our desires. Epicureans. Desires could be groundless and natural. What are the groundless desires? The groundless desires would be things like fame, material luxuries, jewelry. Well, today we can say designer clothes. This is groundless because there's really no reason for them whatsoever. In fact, they thought that this stuff, like I said, only makes you unhappy. You're worried about losing it. You're spending money on it, which otherwise you could use for more useful things. So that is groundless. Natural desires, on the other hand, could also be unnecessary. Some of them are necessary, some of them are unnecessary. What are the unnecessary but natural desires? Sex, delicious foods. Why do you think he thought it was unnecessary? Can you live without sex? Yeah, you can live without sex. So even though it is a natural desire to have sex for human beings, but it is unnecessary. And same thing with delicious food. Do you have to have delicious food? Can you not eat something which is bland? You can eat something bland. It still will give you nutrition. So only necessary natural desires are the ones to pursue, and that would be three types. For happiness, wisdom, and friendship. He really, really valued friendship. He had many friends, and he thought friendship is one of the best things. It's better than sex, because sex immediately kind of brings up all those power relations and fear of losing and all that. But friendship is not like that. It's all about just being with your friends, enjoying your friends. So that is one of the most important necessary and natural desires we have. Then for comfort, adequate clothing. You don't need designer clothing, but obviously if it's cold, you want to have a warm coat. And if you are going hiking, you need hiking boots. Greeks didn't have hiking boots, but I'm sure they had some sort of appropriate footwear. And then for life, water and food. Obviously you need water and food, otherwise you will die. And that would be natural and necessary desire. So as you can see, the life Epicureans actually considered to be life of pleasure is very different from what most people would think. Even though they thought you should pursue pleasure, but that would be a very different type of pleasure. Nothing luxurious, no delicious foods, only friendship and then adequate clothing and water and food enough to sustain yourself. Doesn't have to be delicious. So here is the quote. For what produces the pleasant life is not continuous drinking and parties or pederasty or womanizing or the enjoyment of fish and other dishes of the expensive table, but sober reasoning which tracks down the causes of every choice and avoidance, and which banishes the belief that beset souls with the greatest confusion. So, drinking, parties, pederasty, womanizing just makes you unhappy. That is what Epicurus thought. On the other hand, friendship and decent conversation, that would be the things which truly pleasurable. A lot of it we will see also in what Mill later introduced. So characteristics of happy life for Epicureans were prudence, self-sufficiency. The more self-sufficient you are, the better. If you depend on other people or things, then that of course could be a source of unhappiness. Sober reasoning, honor, justice, wisdom, but again as instrumental to this happiness, because this is what gives you friends, first of all. This is what makes other people respect you, and therefore it gives you pleasure. Health of the body, well, clearly you don't want to be sick. That's not fun for anybody. Peace of mind and plain food. Very austere kind of life. Now, virtue itself is the means to pleasure. One must honor the noble and the virtues and things like that if they produce pleasure. But if they do not, one must bid them goodbye. So somewhat of a cynical approach, but again, you can see already this modern 2,000-year-old Greek wisdom coming back in the 19th century, and effectively similar approach. Things like virtue, justice, morality, and so on are brought back to pleasure and pain, something simple and physical. Now, Bentham, of course, had a more developed system of calculation. We'll talk about it in more detail, but the basic point is like this. You have to maximize happiness. So pleasure minus pain is net happiness. And you can calculate it like this. Let's say there are two acts, Act A and Act B. Act A makes me happy and two other people happy. So total 3 people. Act B makes me unhappy, but 5 other people happy. So 5. Therefore, we should do Act B. There are some other problems. So obviously, you already noticed, like so far, we were just saying happiness, pleasure, but is there different pleasure? Well, obviously, measuring pleasure is complicated, and Bentham wasn't too stupid not to understand it. So he came up with several criteria. First of all, intensity. How strong is the pleasure? Clearly, some pleasures are stronger than others. Not all pleasures created equal. Pleasure of eating candy is probably not as great as, I don't know, pleasure of reading a good book, and so on. Duration. How long is it? It may be intense pleasure, but very short-lived. On the other hand, a different pleasure could be much longer. For example, renting a nice apartment. You'll be living there for years, so you'll have pleasure lasting years versus some sort of immediate pleasure. Certainty or uncertainty. If the pleasure hasn't happened yet, but you just calculate in odds, that is also important, right? How likely is this pleasure to happen? Especially for legislation, because legislation obviously can only predict what may or may not be happening, and for them in some cases it's important to understand what are the odds. Propinquity or remoteness. How soon will it occur? That is a very important one. People frequently forget about it. In finance, by the way, if you study finance, they put a huge emphasis on that. Because money now versus money later, very different thing. $100 right now is not the same thing as $100 20 years from now. And not just because of the inflation. Even if we discount the inflation, 20 years is a long time. Not all of us will even make it there, right? Somebody may not even be alive 20 years from now. So for some people, $1 million 20 years from now may be less valuable than $100 now because they may not live that long. If you are 80 years old, for example, it's unlikely you'll make it 20 years. So you see that does require some recalculation. What he called fecundity, or fruitfulness. How likely is it to produce more of the same type of emotions? Purity. Will it be followed by pain? In some cases, you may have pleasure followed by pain, in some cases not. And finally, the extent, how many other people will be affected. So book does give some interesting calculations. They're a little simplified, but kind of fun way to look at it too. So here is one example. The pleasure minus pain calculation in a more simple way, but kind of more mathematically sound. Act A produces 12 units of pleasure, right? So intensity of pleasure, 12 units of pleasure. And 12 units of happiness. And 6 of unhappiness. So the calculus 12 minus 6 equals 6. Act B produces 10 units of happiness and only 1 of unhappiness. So 10 minus 1, 9 units of happiness. Therefore, Act B is better than Act A. Now let's look at intensity. Act A gives 40 people mild pleasure. 2 on a scale of 1 to 10. So you can multiply 40 by 2 and get 80 units of pleasure created. Act B gives 10 people intense pleasure, the maximum intensity, 10 out of 10. And so if you calculate that, then you get more pleasure, right? So in this case, 40 people have a little bit of pleasure, total 80. In this case, 10 people get so much pleasure that the total is 100. So now you can compare them in this way. Duration. Let's say Act A gives 3 people each 8 days of happiness. So 3 times 8, 24 days of happiness. Act B gives 6 people each 2 days of happiness. So now 6 times 2, 12 days of happiness. So total days of happiness is more in the first case. Fruitfulness. That's a little bit harder to calculate in this way, but the question here is, how will this pleasure increase by experience of my experience of other pleasures? Depends not just in immediate happiness, but happiness is in the long run. For example, the pain of a dentist appointment will result in much more happiness in the long run because our teeth will be healthy. Going to school for a degree is painful, but will result in long-term happiness. Well, that's a little bit debatable, I guess, right? I mean, do you guys think going to school is painful?
Depends on the day.
It depends on the day. Some days more painful than others. Well, I guess the very fact that you have to go somewhere may be a bit painful, especially with parking, right? I'm quite lucky now with the staff parking. It's not bad at all, but I remember the days when I was parking as a student, and that was not fun. Sometimes it could even get quite heated when somebody wants to spot. So yeah, that then of course is pain, but it's not from going to school. It's more of like the kind of pain you can encounter almost anywhere, right? Going to a sporting event or whatever. I don't know. For me personally, just studying and learning new things is pleasure in itself. But I guess some people don't feel this way, and I know some people don't. Some people feel like, okay, I want a degree, but I don't want to study. So how do I feel? How do I kind of combine it in a way that I study as little as possible, but still get a degree, and try to find this middle course? And that, of course, is the problem, because then, yeah, you really can't approach it this way. I don't know. Honestly, you have to find a way to enjoy what you study. And one way I usually recommend is study what you like, right? Because a lot of people go into like hard science. Oh yeah, there's a lot of money in it. I want to do like computer science or something. And then discover that they hate it. It's absolutely horrible for them. They have no thing for it naturally, so they struggle and struggle and struggle, and they hate going to school as a result too. And eventually, well, maybe they will somehow torture themselves all the way to a degree, but I don't think they'll enjoy this job either. So that's not the best way to approach it. Anyway, and then likelihood. Likelihood can also be calculated in probabilities, right? So let's say Act A has 90% chance of giving 8 people each 5 days of pleasure. So that's now kind of a more complicated calculation. We have 8 people, 5 days of pleasure, so that's total 40 days of pleasure, and we multiply it by 0.9, 90% chance, and we get 36 days of pleasure. And the other one, Act B, has 40% chance of giving 10 people each 7 days of pleasure. So 70 days times 0.4, 28 days of pleasure. We'll talk more about the problems with utilitarianism next time, but even looking at that, what do you think? Is this like realistic calculation? What could be the problem with all of this? Yeah. If you read the chapter, like what we're going to talk about next time is the tram example, like the whether you kill one person or 5 people, are you going to? So that is part of it too. But even just the calculation, like this is so much math. Where are they getting that? Like how are you measuring pleasure? I mean, okay, I can say that I will probably get more pleasure from a good book than from eating a candy, but I can't precisely calculate it and then say, okay, maybe 20 pieces of candy is equivalent to one book. No, it's not. It's just different type of pleasure. You can't compare it. And this is actually where Mill is going to make it a little bit more realistic than Bentham. For Bentham, it's just very simple math, and it seems like it's an interesting approach, but it's very unrealistic. To calculate it in this precise way is practically impossible. Well, he did try to apply that to social policy, right? And he said when social policy is made, 2 questions should be asked. What end does it accomplish? So this consequentialism. So what are we are passing this law. What is the end goal? Can this policy be improved so as to be more effective in maximizing total happiness? I guess for this, you don't necessarily need to calculate it exactly, but you can have some idea whether it can be maximizing happiness and giving more people certain happiness or not. And there are certainly debates to be had about how much exactly and whether it should be done. But as long as you at least understand the idea that in the end of the day, government passing a law should pursue happiness of people and should look at it in this kind of way that happiness overall must be maximized. We should try to make people more happy, not less happy. And that's the goal of the government, goal of the state. Of course, punishment is evil, punishment is bad, but it can be morally justified if it prevents greater evil. In this sense, that's why they put people in jail and so on. It's not so much specifically punish this person so they'd be tortured, but to prevent others from doing the same thing, right? So you can look at it from this purely utilitarian point of view. If you don't punish people for stealing, then people will be stealing. If you don't punish them for murdering, they'll be murdered. But if you start putting them in jail for this, or death penalty, or whatever it is, then you may have better or worse chances preventing it. How do you know? Well, this is where you can use statistics, you can calculate, you can see what are the results of this crime. And this is really the way we still think about public policy, right? The public policy, at least ideally, should be measured by this principle, maximizing total happiness. Are we making people more happy or not? And if we are not, then of course that's a problem. Nietzsche was really, yeah.
Would you say, like, just talking about like public policy and everything like that, of like how many people it's making happy versus how many it's not making happy, do you think that our government follows that as it is right now?
That's an interesting question, right? The whole point of democracy, the fact that we are electing people, is to achieve this. Because they have to be responsible to us, and ideally, in order to be responsible to us, they have to make us happy. But what can be problematic? This is what Plato noticed, right? You can be buying people off. That's what populism is. Like, let's say, in the long run, this policy is horrible. It will ruin us and cause some horrible consequences. But in the short run, people will be happy. A lot of the tax breaks are like this. Like, this is a good example right now. The government is in debt. We have no money. Why are we giving tax breaks? Well, the traditional explanation is that it will somehow encourage people to work more, and as a result, the economy will grow, and we will still get even more money. It has been proven many times that's not happening. We will actually talk about it more later when we talk about economic policy and economic justice, but yeah. No, yeah, that there is a lot of the calculation. I don't know if you read about, they deliberately did it in such a way that there are a lot of tax breaks, like no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime. And traditionally, when the bill is passed, they immediately start reducing the part of your paycheck which goes towards those things. But the calculation they deliberately had is not to do it so that people would get a bigger tax return. And when you get bigger tax return, that is kind of, you will feel it better, right? Because it's a little bit out of every paycheck, you don't feel it as much. But when you get one big payout at once, you will go, oh, I love Trump, isn't it fantastic? Thank God there's a big, beautiful bill here. So the whole thing was definitely calculated in a way to make people happy in a short term. You get a big tax break, of course you are happy. The question is, what does it do to the country years from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Well, some politicians clearly don't care. They only look at it from the point of view there are elections coming up right now. We want to win these elections. After that, who knows? And that is the problem with democracy, which, like I said, even Plato has noticed. Politicians do have tendency to give this kind of handouts sometimes and so on. Now, obviously, the other problem is that the majority of the benefit goes to the billionaires from the big, beautiful bill. That has been also published and shown. Another idea which Trump came up with now, I don't know if you heard, to use tariffs to replace income taxes. Have you heard about that? Yeah. Well, I doubt they do it because they're not getting enough money from tariffs, and that's not realistic to replace the entire. But let's say they did. What would actually happen? Who would benefit from that? Funny enough, again, billionaires and the rich people would benefit the most. Why? Because they don't spend their entire income. The wealthier you are, the more of your income goes into savings. And when it goes into savings, obviously you're not paying any tariffs. The more poor you are, the more part of your income you are spending on goods. In fact, poor people spend 100%. They don't save anything, and therefore they'll be paying higher taxes. Effectively, if you buy in stuff, and most of this stuff, if not produced abroad, then at least has components produced abroad, and that's not going to change anytime soon, you will be paying taxes based on how much you are purchasing. So if you calculate, you'll see that the poor people would probably then pay 10–15% tax, and the billionaires will be paying like 1% tax or even less. So that's what will happen if he does that. But he really loves this idea, so who knows? Yeah, that is again a problem. On one hand, obviously, taxes, who likes taxes? I don't like taxes either, especially given how complicated they are. Like, you sometimes need experts to even fill the damn thing, and they take hundreds of dollars for this. And there's so many complicated laws, and like, I try to do it myself because I like researching, but oh my God, that is so difficult. It's just insane. And that is a problem. But the idea is to maximize happiness, taking into account the fact that we're not going to die tomorrow. We're going to still be here, our children are going to be here, and what will happen? Same thing, by the way, since you brought it up, the environment, right? The global warming. Yeah, if you are 80 years old, I guess you don't care that much. How much do you have left? But what happens to the rest of us, like 20, 30, 40 years from now? Yeah, let's just drive this cars on gas, and like, why put all those regulations? Well, in the short run, obviously the economy will be doing better because, yeah, those regulations cost money. You need to put a lot of investment into this energy which does not produce CO2 and all this stuff. But that is like long-term benefit. We need to do something. Even the fact what they had was not enough. Like the scientists are saying, that was not enough. That was better than nothing, but not nearly enough. But what is proposed now is just like, oh, let's to hell with all of this. Who cares? It's all a scheme. Well, look at what is happening with the climate. You can see it without even any science. Like, I mean, it's obvious. It's already crazy. It literally is crazy. We here like have 85 degrees yesterday. East Coast, they have like snow and crazy blizzards and whatnot. Well, like I said, if you're 8 years old, you may think, oh, who cares? But I have a couple of years left. I'll still have fun. And after me, I don't care. But that is the problem. Bentham and other utilitarianists were considered very radical for this time. Remember, this is 19th century. In England, at that time, there was still like this old type of thinking, and the idea that you should have equal privileges for all people, everybody deserves happiness, was a very novel idea. Many people, the aristocrats, the lords, didn't like it at all. They thought that this was the wrong way to go. And for this reason, they were actually known, the Bentham and James Mill were known as radicals, because they were introducing this, but it was picking up. England, in fact, as early as the 19th century, started passing laws which were some supportive of the poor people, supportive of the people who don't have any income, and so on. So that already started at the time, and it became more and more prominent as time went by. And I don't know if you know, now in England they have free medical care. That's one of the reasons it was passed in the 20th century, the law. But they passed a law which just made medical care completely free for everybody. So if you live in UK, even as a student, as I was, you get completely free medical care. And it actually worked pretty well. It gets a little hard now because of the funding. There's always this problem of funding, because in the end of the day, the government is the one who's paying for it, and the government runs out of money. They have other stuff like the military and whatnot to pay for, so they try to cut the funding. And when they cut the funding, there's fewer doctors available. And when there are fewer doctors, there are longer lines. But I don't think it's any worse than what we have, because our system, even in terms of seeing a doctor, I needed a doctor a couple of years ago. I called them. I have insurance and everything. They said 6 months from now. I was like, are you kidding me? What, 6 months? Yeah, that's the soonest appointment. Would you take it? And I'm like, well, I don't think I'll be still sick 6 months from now, so I guess not. I don't even need it. Then the only other choice is urgent care, but it's not really the same thing as having a doctor, you know, on a regular basis taking care of your needs. So I don't think we have it any better, but it also is extremely expensive. At least they have it free. Okay, so next time we'll talk about Mill. Make sure to do the reading. Mill brings a lot of more interesting ideas into it. He is not as straightforward as Bentham. And for this reason, he is probably easier to apply and to like. Okay, so that would be all for today. See you guys on Wednesday.